For one brief, dangerous moment in ancient Rome, the most powerful office in the empire was treated like something that could be bought, not by the Roman people, not by a vote of the Senate, but by armed men behind the walls of the Praetorian camp. The emperor had been murdered. The palace was uncertain, the city was afraid, and the soldiers who had sworn to protect imperial power now realized they could sell access to it. Ancient writers describe what followed as an auction. Two men competed for the support of the Praetorian Guard. One of them was Didius Julianus. He won the bidding. He received the title. He entered the palace. And after a reign reported as only 66 days, he was abandoned, condemned, and killed. Julianus did not simply buy Rome. He bought a throne from men who could not sell him legitimacy. This is the story of the emperor remembered for one of the most astonishing political moments in Roman history. A moment when imperial power appeared to pass not by inheritance, not by battlefield victory, and not by constitutional order, but by a promise of money to soldiers. But the deeper story is not just that Didius Julianus paid too much for power. It is that the Roman Empire revealed a terrifying weakness. The emperor's title could be proclaimed in Rome. The Senate could be pressured to recognize it. Coins could be struck. Honors could be granted. Guards could escort a man through the streets. But none of that meant the empire would obey. In the spring of 193 CE, Julianus discovered that the throne could be purchased in the capital, but authority still had to be accepted by the armies, the Senate, the people, and the wider Roman world. And almost immediately, all of them began slipping away from him. The crisis began in the shadow of Commodus. At the end of 192 CE, Commodus was assassinated. His death ended a reign remembered by ancient writers as corrupt, violent, and unstable. In the first hours of 193, the empire turned to Pertinax. Pertinax was not a young heir raised for purple. He was a senior figure, a man associated with discipline, restraint, and an attempt to restore order after the excesses of Commodus's rule. For some in Rome, he represented a correction. For the Praetorian Guard, he quickly became a problem. The Praetorians were not ordinary soldiers on a distant frontier. They were the imperial guard stationed near the heart of power. In Roman politics, their support could be decisive. Their anger could be fatal. Pertinax tried to impose discipline. He tried to manage finances. He tried to pull the imperial household and the military back from the habits of the previous reign. But reform was dangerous when the men being reformed held weapons inside the capital. Tensions rose. Expectations around money and privilege collided with Pertinax's attempt to restore restraint. Then, on 28 March 193, Praetorian soldiers entered the palace. Ancient sources differ on exact details, including the number of attackers, but they agree on the central fact. Pertinax was murdered by Praetorian soldiers. The emperor was dead. His killers withdrew. And Rome was left with a question that could not wait. Who now ruled the empire? There was no uncontested successor standing ready. No smooth handover. No settled order. Instead, power moved toward the men with immediate force in the city, the Praetorian Guard. The soldiers who had just killed one emperor were now in a position to decide who would be proclaimed next. And in that vacuum, imperial power became something almost unthinkable. It became a bargain. After Pertinax was killed, one of the men nearest the crisis was Flavius Sulpicianus. He was the urban prefect, and he was also Pertinax's father-in-law. According to ancient accounts, Sulpicianus was at the Praetorian camp, trying to secure the support of the soldiers. In a different political world, that might have made him the obvious successor. He had position, proximity, and a connection to the murdered emperor. But that same connection may have made the Praetorians uneasy. If Sulpicianus became emperor, would he avenge Pertinax? Would the men who murdered the emperor be punished by the father-in-law of the man they had killed? Ancient writers suggest this fear mattered. The guard had removed an emperor, but they still needed someone to protect them from the consequences. Then came Didius Julianus. Julianus was not a nobody wandering into history by accident. He was a wealthy senator with a serious elite career behind him. He had held offices. He had governed provinces. He belonged to the highest political world of Rome. That matters, because the tragedy of Julianus is not simply that a foolish rich man bought a crown. It is that a man with real status chose the most damaging possible path to the throne. Ancient accounts differ on exactly why Julianus went to the Praetorian camp. Herodian says he was urged by his wife, daughter, and hangers-on. The Historia Augusta gives a different version, saying tribunes encouraged him. Dio presents the scene more directly, with Julianus going once he hears what has happened. The safest truth is this: Julianus went to the Praetorian camp, and once there, he became part of the competition for power. In Dio's account, Sulpicianus was inside the camp, negotiating with the soldiers. Julianus was outside, near the gates or wall. Messages moved back and forth through the Praetorians. The image is almost too symbolic to improve. Inside the walls, one claimant; outside the walls, another. Between them, soldiers carrying the price of empire. Ancient writers describe the Praetorians as offering imperial power to whoever would reward them most. Herodian says they proclaimed the empire for sale to the highest bidder. Dio frames the moment in auction-like terms, describing the city and empire as being offered up. But this was not an auction in the modern sense. There was no public marketplace where the Roman people bid for their own future. There was no legal sale of the empire as property. This was something cruder and more revealing: the armed bodyguard in Rome turning imperial recognition into a donative negotiation. The soldiers wanted money, the claimants wanted the throne, and Rome's highest office was caught between them. According to Cassius Dio, Sulpicianus's offer rose to 20,000 sesterces per soldier. Then Julianus raised the offer by another 5,000. That is the famous figure, 25,000 sesterces per soldier. It should be remembered carefully. It is an ancient report, not an audited payroll record. Other traditions differ on the question of payment, but as a symbol of the crisis, the number endured because it captured the moral shock of the event. The throne of Rome had acquired a price. The Praetorians chose Julianus. They admitted him into the camp. They proclaimed him emperor. And with that, the first part of the bargain was complete. But proclamation by the guard was not the same thing as acceptance by Rome. Julianus still needed the Senate. So the soldiers escorted him through the city, and the Senate, facing armed pressure, recognized him. That recognition matters. Julianus was not merely a private man pretending to be emperor. He received formal recognition. His claim entered the official machinery of Roman power. But Dio's account makes the atmosphere clear. This was recognition under intimidation. Senators came because absence was dangerous. Armed Praetorians surrounded and entered the political space. The Senate's consent was real enough to matter historically, but not free enough to create trust. Julianus had gained the title. He had not gained confidence. And outside the Senate, the city was not celebrating. The people of Rome reacted with hostility. Ancient sources agree on the broad picture: public anger, insults, and rejection. Dio, Herodian, and the Historia Augusta all describe crowds condemning Julianus for buying power. The exact words should be treated cautiously. Ancient historians often shape public scenes for moral effect, but the hostility itself is well supported. Ancient sources portray Rome's people as understanding the scandal clearly enough. An emperor had been murdered, and a new one had emerged after promising money to the same soldiers. An emperor had been murdered. His killers had retreated to camp. A new emperor had emerged after promising money to the same soldiers. To the crowd, Julianus did not look like a restorer of order. He looked like the buyer of a crime. Ancient accounts say people shouted against him, rejected his offers, and called for Pescennius Niger, a powerful commander in the east. The crowd could not simply elect a replacement emperor. This was not a democratic revolution. But the public reaction mattered because it showed that Julianus's rule was poisoned from the beginning. The Senate had recognized him under pressure. The people were hostile. The Praetorians had chosen him for money. And beyond Rome, the provincial armies were watching. This was the weakness at the center of the purchase. The Praetorian Guard could proclaim an emperor in the capital. It could escort him into the Senate. It could put him in the palace. But it could not make the frontier armies obey. And those armies were commanded by men with soldiers of their own. 3 names now mattered: Pescennius Niger in the east, Clodius Albinus in Britain, and Septimius Severus in Pannonia. All 3 represented a different kind of power from Julianus. They did not need to buy the Praetorian camp. They commanded armies, and Severus moved fastest. Septimius Severus understood the moment. He presented himself not as the buyer of power, but as the avenger of Pertinax. That claim gave him a moral weapon against Julianus and a military one against the Praetorians. From Pannonia, Severus began moving toward Italy and Rome. As he advanced, Julianus tried to respond. He declared Severus a public enemy. He attempted defensive preparations. He sent envoys. Ancient sources describe a series of desperate measures: efforts to secure troops, improvised defenses, attempts to negotiate, and attempts to stop Severus before he reached the capital. But the closer Severus came, the less real Julianus's authority looked. The Praetorians who had sold him the title were not the same as a hardened provincial army advancing with purpose. Dio and other sources ridicule the military readiness of Julianus's forces. The details vary, and some are shaped by hostile authors, but the larger point is consistent. The emperor in Rome could not rely on the force that had made him emperor. He had bought the guard's proclamation. He had not bought their courage. And he had not bought the loyalty of the empire. The crisis accelerated. Envoys sent against Severus failed or defected. Cities and forces in Italy did not rise decisively for Julianus. The aura of power moved away from the palace and toward the approaching army. Every mile Severus marched made the auction look smaller. Every defection made the title look emptier. Julianus still possessed the symbols of empire. But symbols are dangerous when everyone can see they are hollow. The central irony of Didius Julianus is that winning the bidding may have made him weaker. Had he seized power through a clean military victory, Rome might have feared him. Had he inherited power through dynastic succession, Rome might have accepted him. Had he emerged as the obvious compromise after Pertinax, the Senate might have tolerated him. But Julianus came to power through the most humiliating path imaginable. He was the man chosen by soldiers after he promised them more money than his rival. The transaction gave him immediate access to the throne, but it destroyed the story a ruler needed to tell about himself. Roman emperors did not rule by one source of legitimacy alone. They needed armed support, institutional recognition, public tolerance, provincial acceptance, and a story that made their rule seem legitimate. Different emperors balanced those forces differently, but no emperor could safely despise all of them at once. Julianus began with a title that exposed its own weakness. To the Praetorians, he was a source of promised money. To the Senate, he was a man recognized under armed pressure. To the people, he was the purchaser of power after a murder. To the provincial armies, He was an emperor made by a city guard they did not necessarily respect. That is why buying the throne did not solve the crisis. It advertised the crisis. The men who sold him power could not guarantee that others would honor the sale. This was the turning point. The auction did not end the civil conflict. It began it. Severus understood that Julianus's greatest vulnerability was moral as much as military. By aligning himself with the memory of Pertinax, Severus positioned his march as punishment and restoration, not merely rebellion. Julianus, meanwhile, struggled to turn recognition into rule. Ancient accounts differ over whether he fully paid what he promised. Herodian suggests he could not fulfill expectations. Other traditions report different amounts. The safe conclusion is that the payment issue itself became part of a wider distrust. If he paid, he was still the man who bought the throne. If he failed to pay, he had even lost the men who sold it to him. Either way, the bargain could not save him. The Senate began to sense where power was going. The soldiers began to sense it. The people already seemed to know. Julianus was emperor in name, but the future was approaching from Pannonia, and it was marching behind Septimius Severus. As Severus came closer, Julianus became more isolated. His options narrowed. He attempted resistance. He attempted negotiation. He reportedly even considered arrangements that might share power or delay the confrontation. But none of it reversed the movement of events. Severus entered Italy with momentum. Ravenna and other strategic positions fell away from Julianus's control or failed to resist effectively. The Praetorian Guard, whose support had lifted Julianus into power, could not stop the challenger. The Senate moved. The same institution that had recognized Julianus under pressure now abandoned him. The Senate deposed Julianus and recognized Severus. After that, Julianus was no longer even protected by the fiction that Rome's institutions stood behind him. Ancient sources differ in the exact details of his final moments. Dio says he was killed in the palace and reports dramatic final words, but those should be treated as Dio's version, not as a verified transcript. Herodian describes him deserted and weeping when a tribune came. The Historia. Augusta says he was killed in the palace by a common soldier. The safest account is stark enough. Julianus was abandoned in the imperial residence and killed after a reign reported as 66 days. 66 days after the Praetorians raised him up, the title they had sold him was worthless. The empire had not obeyed the purchase, and the man who had won the bidding died without the durable power his bargain had promised. Didius Julianus is remembered because his reign made visible something Rome often tried to hide. Imperial power was surrounded by ritual, titles, purple cloth, Senate decrees, military standards, and sacred language. But beneath those symbols was a harder question. Who would obey? In 193 CE, the Praetorian Guard answered that question for itself. It murdered Pertinax, then treated the throne as something that could be exchanged for reward. Julianus accepted the bargain. He received the title. He entered the palace. But the bargain contained its own ruin. The Guard could sell him access to power in Rome. It could not sell him loyalty in the provinces. It could not sell him trust from the Senate. It could not sell him acceptance from the people. And it could not sell him time. The most unbelievable part of the story is not merely that the Roman imperial throne was described by ancient writers as being auctioned. It is that the winning bid failed almost immediately. Didius Julianus bought a proclamation. He bought a ceremony. He bought a place in the palace. But he did not buy an empire. And for Rome, the lesson was ominous. When soldiers discover they can sell the throne itself becomes weaker.